In our series of the book of James, how he calls a spade a spade. He's very direct in his teaching. He doesn't beat about the bush, and what he says is very practical. Danny, you remember, Danny Morris at the start of this little mini-series talked about James's argument that faith without works is dead faith. And then you remember how David Chilman spoke about how to preserve joy and peace even though you're going through a time of trial. And then we looked at the contrast between godly wisdom and human wisdom. And last week, Bishop David told us about how we need to control our tongues so that they spread good instead of evil. And all the time, James is drawing a contrast between true and false religion. He starts right in the very first chapter. He says, if anyone thinks he's religious and doesn't bridle his tongue and deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. And then he goes on to summarize what true religion is. Visiting widows and orphans in their distress, and keeping oneself unstained from the world. And today we are now arriving at the penultimate in our series of James. And again, we have a very direct piece of teaching. It's about what has become known as the royal law, or if you like, the golden rule. It really sums up all that governs human relationships and healthy human relationships. The rule that Jesus himself described as the second of the two great commandments: love your neighbor as yourself. And then it's on those two commandments that the law and the prophets hang. That command actually goes all the way back to Old Testament times. In the book of Leviticus, in chapter 19, verse 18, you will find exactly that. Love your neighbor as yourself. And what James is doing is he's making very clear that this statement about true and false religion is not just theoretical. We practice either true or false religion in our daily lives and every time we assemble, as we have done this morning. And James is warning us here not to make distinctions between people according to their status. We're very prone, aren't we, to being preoccupied with ourselves, and that leads to all sorts of selfish behaviors, almost always based on how another person either makes us feel or offends against our perception of value and worth. And we're all too inclined to dismiss somebody if we don't perceive that they're of any value to us. How true that is. If a Jewish person walked through a Gentile area, when they left the Gentile area, they would take their sandals off, and they would knock the dust off the bottom of them, and then they'd step back into the Jewish area and they'd put their sandals back on. They didn't want to bring dirt from the Gentiles into the Jewish area. And they'd walk hundreds of miles sometimes to avoid walking through Gentile areas for fear of contamination. But you know, when Paul preached in Acts chapter 10, after the conversion of Cornelius, he said, God is no respecter of persons. What that means is you ought not to accept or reject someone based on their physical appearance, at face value. You know, it could be the colour of their skin, it could be their social status, it could be whether they're male or whether they're female, it could be whether they're born from a certain country or ethnicity, it could be their money, it could be the way they dress. James is telling us that to take a view of these people based on those criteria is not consistent with following Jesus Christ. It's inconsistent with faith. God doesn't look about the way that people look like or how they smell, but rather God looks on the heart. And so verse 1 of the passage that we read in James gives that very powerful illustration, and we illustrated it here today. The most glorious and honourable Mrs. Hyacinth Bouquet, and him down there. It's interesting, isn't it? You know, she has all the finest clothes. Her rings, her fingers are dripping with gold, you know, gold on all of her fingers. She probably came here in a Rolls Royce or a Lamborghini. And when she showed herself up for the service, of course we welcomed her. We gave her an effusive welcome. We guided her to her seat. And I heard the ushers saying, oh, there's a really rich woman come to the church today. Out with your checkbook, was the instinctive reaction. Do you know that in ancient days they actually had places where you could rent rings to wear for high society outings so that you could impress people with your wealth? And then he shows up. She, of course, sits in the special pew, and those are special pews. I don't know if you realise that you're sitting in the special pews. There's a gate there. In days gone by, people used to own those pews if they got enough money. It's the rich man's pews that you're all sitting in there. And there's a gate to make sure that the riffraff don't enter that territory. And he comes along. He's smelly. He's dirty. He's rowdy. He's disruptive. He slams the door. He knocks the Bibles to the ground. He's the kind of person that you might say, if you saw him walking into the church, I think we won't go to church today. We'll avoid him. We'll keep clear of him. And in fact, in the account that James gives, it wasn't just that you could come and sit down here, but actually, you know, you can stand in the corner, or even worse, you can sit on the floor because you're not worthy to sit on one of the chairs. Now, it's obvious, isn't it? It's obvious that that kind of thing never, ever ought to happen in the church. The ground is level at the foot of the cross. God looks at the heart. He doesn't look at our clothes. He doesn't look at our jewellery. We should never cater for those who are rich or affluent or look the way we want them to look. But we should look at the heart, and we should treat all with dignity and respect. They had respect for people who wore beautiful and expensive clothes. And so James says they showed partiality, favoritism, and they were judges with evil thoughts. That phrase, judges with evil thoughts, it could be translated as judges with wrong standards. It's been a problem in the church for a long time. Even in the 18th century, you could only come to church if you had enough money to buy a pew. And you can see those pews in this very church. You could pay money so that nobody else would sit in that area. But it wasn't until people like John Wesley came along who took the church outside. He preached the gospel in the fields, to the common people, to the ordinary people, to the farmers. He never had a public address system. He didn't have any of the pomp and ceremony. And yet he used to gather congregations numbering into their thousands. Indeed, there was one record of 30,000 people in a large field hearing John Wesley preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. Some of them were coal miners, and their faces will be black from mining the coal. And as they heard John Wesley preach, they would have white streaks on their cheeks from their tears. I'm thinking as well of William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, brought poor people into the church, and he was rebuked. They told him, "You can't bring this riffraff into the church because they're not wearing Christian clothes." So he went out into the streets and he shared the gospel with the poor. And that started another revival, a revival that resulted in the founding of the Salvation Army. Now, in our systems, in the world, in our culture, success is what is rewarded and celebrated. And it's manifested in different ways. It can be manifested in your physical appearance, in your material possessions, in your cars, or maybe in your academic degrees or your career accomplishments, your social prominence. It's all about how I look rather than who I am and how I live. The book of Proverbs says the rich and the poor have this in common: the Lord is the maker of them all. And the point is that showing favoritism or partiality, if you like, being a snob, is contrary to or inconsistent with the grace of God. And yet God says the poor of this world are rich in faith. So they're in this world poor, but as far as God is concerned, they have immeasurable wealth. And it's important to understand the basis on which God chooses us to be his own. It's not because of the color of our skin. It's not because of our money or our income or our status or our education or our nationality. It's because of his grace. Grace is undeserved, unearned, unmerited favor. It's God's riches at Christ's expense. You're not saved because of something you do or who you are. Rather, you are saved by grace. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that rich people are not saved. I'm not saying that at all. God chooses rich and poor for his blessing. But listen to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. He says, "You see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world and the things that are despised, God has chosen. And the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, so that no flesh shall glory in his presence." Now, in the early church, I'm sure you would understand that many Christians were poor. They were often owned by slave masters. There's a very classic story, a letter that Paul wrote to Philemon and his slave Onesimus. Onesimus ran away from his master, and he was saved under Paul's ministry in Rome. And Paul sent him back to his master with a request. He said, "Philemon, receive this man back as a beloved brother." So you see, slave and master would worship in the same church together. Sometimes a slave would be given a gift of teaching, and he would get up and preach the word, and his master would be sitting next to him, hearing him preach the word. What an astonishment, what a reversal that amounted to. So as I conclude today, This passage makes some very strong points. Firstly, it's about fulfilling the royal law, the golden rule, the law of the king, if you like. It's the law, the divine standard, that if you show partiality, if you discriminate on any grounds at all, it's a real sin, and it's a serious sin. It isn't about where we're born or raised or the cultural environment that has shaped us. Partiality is a sin. It's against divine authority, and it's inconsistent with God's mercy. The magnitude of the sin is actually made clear very much in verse 10 of the passage that we read. You can keep the whole law, but if you fail in one point, you're accountable for all of it. To break a piece of glass is to break the whole glass. So our congregation here should reflect God's grace. We're not Jew, we're not Gentile, we're not bond, we're not free, we're not male, we're not female. We're in Christ and we're all one. We may not be binary. We may not all be the same. We may not all have the same mental capacity. We may not all have the ability to behave in exactly the same way or exhibit the same level of ecclesiastical decorum that Mrs. Bucket produces, unlike this man here. Do you know what? This congregation here in Sanderstead is a warm-hearted, generous, welcoming and loving congregation. And I really thank God for that. But we really need to make sure that we continue to measure others by the grace that we have received ourselves. And I'm telling you this for a reason. For some of us who meet on Thursday for communion, we have had, from time to time, somebody come in who behaves differently from the way we do. And it can be quite disruptive. And that person may be coming to more of our services in the future. And we need to be prepared for that. If somebody comes into our church whose behavior and sense of ecclesiastical decorum is different from what we have experienced so far, how are we going to react? We need to be ready for that, because it's important to measure others by the grace we have received ourselves, rather than the way they perform or the way they behave. So let's always remember that the gospel is a leveler, and it calls us to love even as we have been loved, impartially, unconditionally, and unstintingly. Amen. You can relax.